The wagon wheel cracked clean through just as the sun began to set over the Idaho hills, and Josephine Vance knew with absolute certainty that this broken wheel would be the thing that finally killed her. She stood beside the listing wagon on the rutted trail, 5 miles outside Lewiston, Idaho, staring at the splintered wood with hands that had long ago stopped shaking from exhaustion. It was September of 1876, and she had been traveling alone for 3 weeks since burying her father beside a nameless creek in Wyoming. The wagon contained everything she owned in the world, which was to say it contained almost nothing worth mentioning. A few pots with holes in them, blankets so thin they barely kept out the cold, clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches, her father's rifle, which she barely knew how to fire, and a small wooden box containing her mother's letters, the only things she would have grabbed if the wagon caught fire. Josephine had never owned anything new in her entire 22 years of life. Everything she had ever worn or used or slept under had belonged to someone else first. Hand-me-downs from church charity, cast-offs from better-off families, things purchased at second-hand stores or traded for labor. Even the dress she wore now had been her mother's before consumption took her 6 years ago, and her mother had received it from the doctor's wife she had worked for as a laundress. The wheel could not be fixed. She could see that clearly even with her limited knowledge of wagon repair. The hub had cracked straight through, and the spokes had splintered outward like broken bones. She had no tools to repair it, no money to pay someone else to repair it, and no strength left to drag the wagon's contents the remaining miles to Lewiston. She sat down on the side of the trail and put her head in her hands. The horse, an ancient gelding named George who was as worn out as everything else in her life, cropped grass nearby with supreme indifference to their situation. The September air carried the first hints of the coming winter, and Josephine knew she could not spend the night out here. Mountain lions roamed these hills, bears too, and men who were worse than either. She was trying to decide whether to unhitch George and ride him into town bareback, leaving everything behind, when she heard the sound of bootsteps on the trail. Heavy steps, confident. She looked up and felt her breath catch in her throat. The man walking toward her looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the setting sun behind him. His arms, visible beneath the rolled-up sleeves of his buckskin shirt, were corded with muscle that shifted and flexed with each movement. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He carried a rifle with the casual ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it, and a large hunting knife hung from his belt. His eyes, she noticed as he came closer, were a startling blue-gray, like creek water reflecting a winter sky. He stopped a respectful distance away, taking in the scene with a single sweeping glance. His gaze moved from the broken wheel to her face to George grazing nearby, and she saw understanding flicker across his features. "That wheel is beyond fixing," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together but not unkind. "I know," Josephine said, trying to keep her voice steady. She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. She was not afraid of this stranger exactly, but she was aware that she was completely at his mercy. "I was just deciding what to do about it." He moved closer, dropping to one knee beside the wheel to examine it more closely. This close, she could see the breadth of his chest, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the weathered tan of his skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hands were huge, scarred, and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard at difficult things. "Where are you headed?" he asked, standing up in one fluid movement. "Lewiston. I was hoping to find work there. Alone. My father died 3 weeks ago. Fever. She did not know why she was telling this stranger her business, but something in his direct gaze made her speak honestly. I have no other family. He nodded slowly, processing this information. I am Victor Kaine. I have a cabin about 2 miles north of here, up in the mountains. I can take you into Lewiston tomorrow if you need, but it will be dark soon. You should not be out here after nightfall. Josephine felt her heart begin to pound. The offer was generous, perhaps too generous. She had heard stories about what happened to women who trusted strange men in isolated places. But she had also heard stories about what happened to women who spent nights alone on mountain trails, and those stories did not end any better. I would need to bring my things, she said carefully, watching his face for any sign of deception or danger. Naturally. He moved toward the wagon and began unhitching George with practiced efficiency. My mule is tethered a quarter-mile back. We will load what we can on both animals and make 2 trips if needed, but we should move quickly. There are predators in these hills. She wanted to laugh at that. There were predators everywhere, as far as she could tell. At least this one was offering help rather than simply taking what he wanted. They worked together in the fading light, loading her meager possessions onto George and then onto Victor's mule, a sturdy animal with intelligent eyes and a patient demeanor. Victor moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to hard work, lifting heavy items that would have required all her strength as though they weighed nothing. She noticed that he was careful not to touch her or stand too close, maintaining a respectful distance that eased some of her worry. The walk to his cabin took them up a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, and Josephine found herself staying close to Victor's broad back, trusting him to navigate the path. He moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and root, never stumbling, never hesitating. The cabin appeared suddenly in a small clearing, larger than she had expected and sturdily built. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows. A lean-to stood beside the cabin, providing shelter for animals, and she could see a forge set up near the back, the anvil catching moonlight. "You are a blacksmith?" she asked, surprised. "Among other things. I trap, hunt, do metalwork, whatever is needed." He led the animals to the lean-to and began unloading her things. "You will sleep inside. I will take the lean-to tonight." "I cannot turn you out of your own home," Josephine protested. He looked at her with those creek water eyes, and she saw something like amusement flicker across his face. "I have slept in worse places than a lean-to. You will be safe inside. The door bars from the inside." He carried her possessions into the cabin and showed her where everything was located. The interior was neat and well organized, with a large fireplace at one end and a solid bed frame at the other. Furs and blankets were piled on the bed, more blankets than she had ever seen in one place. A table and 2 chairs sat near the fireplace. Shelves held supplies and equipment. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but lived with purpose and order. "There is stew in the pot," Victor said, gesturing to the iron pot hanging over the fire. "Help yourself. I will be outside if you need anything." He left before she could thank him properly, closing the door behind him. Josephine stood in the center of the cabin, trying to process the strangeness of the day. She had woken that morning despairing beside a broken wagon, and now she stood in a warm cabin with food and shelter, protected by a stranger who had asked nothing of her. She barred the door as he had suggested, then served herself a bowl of stew. It was simple but well made, rich with venison and root vegetables. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think about what might happen tomorrow. She slept deeply that night, exhausted by weeks of worry and travel, and woke to the sound of metal ringing against metal. Dawn light filtered through the windows, and when she unbarred the door and stepped outside, she saw Victor at his forge, stripped to the waist despite the morning chill, hammer in hand as he worked a piece of glowing metal. Josephine stood transfixed, unable to look away. His torso was a landscape of muscle and sinew, his arms flexing with each strike of the hammer. Sweat gleamed on his skin despite the cool air, and his hair was tied back with a leather cord. He moved with absolute focus, completely absorbed in his work, and she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest as she watched him. He must have sensed her presence because he looked up, catching her staring. She felt heat rush to her face and quickly turned away, busying herself with tending to George. "There is coffee inside," Victor called out, "and bread in the tin by the fireplace." She fled back into the cabin, her heart pounding for reasons she did not want to examine too closely. She poured herself coffee and found the bread, which was dense and hearty and better than anything she had managed to bake in the back of a moving wagon. When Victor came inside a while later, he had put his shirt back on, though it hung open at the neck, revealing the hollow of his throat. He poured himself coffee and sat down at the table across from her. "I have been thinking about your situation," he said without preamble. "Lewiston is not a good place for a woman alone. There is a mining camp there and the men are rough. You said you need work." "Yes," Josephine said quietly. "I have experience with laundry, mending, cooking. I can work hard," he nodded. "Those skills are valuable, but I have a different proposition for you if you are interested in considering it." She waited, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "I come down to Lewiston once a month to sell furs and metalwork. I bring back supplies, but I am often gone for days at a time on trap lines, and there are things here that need tending. The garden needs harvesting before the first frost. Meat needs smoking. Leather needs working. I could use help with those things." He paused, his eyes steady on her face. "I am offering you employment, Miss Vance. Honest work for fair wages, plus room and board. You would have the cabin. I would sleep in the lean-to. You would be free to leave whenever you wished." Josephine stared at him, trying to understand what he was truly offering. "You do not know me at all. How do you know I would not steal from you or destroy your things?" "I am a good judge of character. You are honest, hard-working, desperate but not desperate enough to do anything foolish." He took a sip of coffee. "And I think you need a place to rest for a while. You look like you have been running for a very long time." She felt tears prick her eyes at the simple truth of that statement. She had been running in one way or another for most of her life. Running from poverty, from hunger, from the endless uncertainty of where the next meal or night's shelter would come from. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked. "Because I was a stranger once and someone helped me when I needed it most." He set down his cup. "Think about it today." "I need to check my trap lines. When I return this evening, you can give me your answer." He left soon after, shouldering his rifle and a pack, and Josephine was alone in the clearing. She spent the day exploring cautiously, trying to understand the life Victor had built here. The garden was impressive, with rows of vegetables thriving in the rich mountain soil. The lean-to was clean and well-maintained, with neat stacks of furs and hides in various stages of preparation. The forge area showed signs of skilled work, with various tools and implements hung in careful order. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately and well, despite his isolation. Or perhaps because of it, she found herself cleaning the cabin, unable to sit still with her thoughts. She swept the floor, organized the shelves more efficiently, and started a stew for dinner using supplies she found in the root cellar. It felt strange to move through another person's space this way, but it also felt good to be useful, to contribute something in exchange for the shelter and safety she had been given. Victor returned as the sun was setting, carrying 3 rabbits and a grouse. He stopped in the doorway of the cabin, taking in the changes she had made, and she saw surprise flicker across his face. "You did not need to do all this," he said. "I wanted to. You have been kind to me." She straightened her shoulders. "And I have decided to accept your offer, Mr. Kaine. I would like to work for you if the offer still stands." "Victor," he said, "if we are going to be living in proximity, you should call me Victor. Then you should call me Josephine." He nodded once, solemn, as though they had just sealed an important agreement, which she supposed they had. The next weeks fell into a pattern that surprised Josephine with its ease. Victor was gone most days, checking trap lines or hunting, and she spent her time working through the dozens of tasks that needed doing before winter arrived. She harvested the garden, storing vegetables in the root cellar and drying herbs in bundles hung from the cabin rafters. She learned to smoke meat properly, tending the smokehouse Victor had built behind the cabin. She mended clothes and worked leather, skills she had learned from her mother, making repairs to Victor's worn clothing and equipment. In the evenings, they ate together at the small table, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Victor was not a man of many words, but the words he did speak were genuine. She learned that he had come west 10 years ago, fleeing something he did not discuss, and had built this life through sheer determination and back-breaking work. He had taught himself blacksmithing by trial and error, ruining countless pieces of metal before he produced anything worth using. He had learned to track and hunt from a Nez Perce man who had taken pity on him during his first desperate winter in the mountains. "I was arrogant," Victor said one evening, whittling a piece of wood by the firelight. "I thought I knew everything. The mountains taught me otherwise." "But you stayed," Josephine said. She was mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. "Where else would I go?" "This is my home now." He glanced at her. "What about you? Where do you call home?" "Nowhere," she said honestly. "We moved constantly when I was growing up. My father was always looking for the next opportunity, the next place where things would be better. They never were." "That sounds lonely." It was. She tied off the thread and reached for another shirt. "But I am used to it. You should not have to be used to being lonely." The simple statement, delivered in his rough voice, made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She bent her head over her mending and did not reply, but she felt something shift between them in that moment, some small opening of trust and understanding. Victor began teaching her things as the weeks passed. How to shoot his rifle properly, standing behind her and adjusting her stance, his hands careful and impersonal on her shoulders. How to identify animal tracks and read the forest for signs of danger. How to work the bellows at his forge while he shaped metal, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm of coordinated effort. She found herself watching him more than she should, fascinated by the way his body moved, the casual display of strength that seemed as natural to him as breathing. When he swung an axe to split wood, muscles rippling across his back and shoulders, she felt her mouth go dry. When he worked at the forge, sweat dampening his shirt, she had to force herself to look away. It was dangerous, this attraction. She knew that. She was an employee, nothing more, and he had given her no indication that he saw her as anything other than a useful pair of hands. But her heart did not seem to understand the boundaries her mind tried to set. October arrived with a cold snap that frosted the grass each morning. Victor made a trip down to Lewiston to sell his goods and returned with supplies for the winter. He also brought her something wrapped in brown paper, handing it to her with an expression that might have been embarrassment. "For you," he said gruffly. "You will need warmer clothes when the snows come." She unwrapped the package with trembling hands and found a wool coat, sturdy and well made, in a dark blue that would hide dirt and wear. For a long moment she could not speak, could not even breathe. The coat was new. She could smell the newness of it, see the crispness of the fabric. "Victor," she whispered, "this is new." "Yes, you needed a proper coat. I have never owned anything new before." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face before she could stop them. "Nothing, not ever." He looked stricken, clearly unprepared for her emotional response. "It is just a coat, Josephine." "No." She clutched the coat to her chest. "No, it is not just a coat." She could not explain to him what it meant, this simple gift. Could not articulate the feeling of being seen, of being valued enough that someone would spend money on something new just for her. She had spent her entire life wearing other people's cast-offs, carrying other people's discarded possessions. And this coat was hers, only hers, chosen for her by a man who barely knew her, but who had somehow understood what she needed. She wore the coat constantly after that, even inside the cabin, unable to take it off. Victor watched her with an expression she could not read, but he said nothing about her strange behavior, just let her have this thing that meant so much to her. The first snow came in mid-October, a light dusting that melted by noon but promised heavier storms to come. Victor began spending more time at the cabin, preparing for the long winter ahead. They worked side by side, filling every available space with firewood, checking the roof for leaks, making sure the lean-to was secure enough to protect the animals through the harsh months ahead. Josephine found herself growing comfortable in his presence, the initial awkwardness fading into something warmer and more natural. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed silence and when he was open to conversation. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly, making her laugh with quiet observations about the world. She learned that he was kind in ways he tried to hide, leaving portions of his dinner in her bowl when he thought she was not looking, chopping extra wood so she would not have to do it herself, doing 100 small things that made her life easier. And she learned that she was falling in love with him, slowly and inevitably, like water flowing downhill. It terrified her. She had no experience with love, no template for what it should look like or how it should feel. Her parents had married out of necessity more than affection, and while they had been fond of each other, she had never seen the kind of passion she read about in the occasional dime novels that came her way. She had certainly never expected to feel it herself. But there was no other word for what she felt when she watched Victor work, when he smiled at something she said, when his hand brushed hers accidentally as they passed dishes at dinner. Her heart raced, her skin felt too warm, and she found herself inventing reasons to be near him, to hear his voice, to exist in his presence. She did not know if he felt anything similar. He was unfailingly polite and respectful, never crossing the boundaries he had established between employer and employee. But sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch, something raw and hungry that vanished as soon as he realized she had noticed. One evening in early November, a major storm rolled through the mountains, bringing heavy snow and howling winds. Josephine sat by the fire, trying to focus on her mending, but the fury of the storm made her nervous. She had never experienced a mountain winter before, and the sheer violence of the wind against the cabin walls frightened her. Victor came inside, snow clinging to his coat and hair. He had been checking on the animals, making sure they had enough shelter and feed to get through the storm. "George and the mule are fine," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "But this storm is going to last a while, could be snowed in for a few days." "Will we have enough supplies?" Josephine asked. "More than enough, do not worry." He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. You are safe here, Josephine. This cabin has weathered worse storms than this. I know. I trust you." The words came out before she could stop them, and she saw something flicker in his eyes at her simple declaration. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Then Victor spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You never talk about what you want for your future, beyond surviving the winter." Josephine set down her mending. "I suppose I have never thought that far ahead. Survival has always been the extent of my planning. But if you could have anything, do anything, what would you choose?" She considered the question seriously. "I would want a home. A real home, not just a place to stay for a while, somewhere I belonged. Somewhere I could put down roots and know I would not have to leave." She looked at him. "What about you? What do you want?" "I have what I want here. The mountains, freedom, honest work." He paused. "But I will admit it gets lonely sometimes. I had not realized how lonely until you came here." Her heart began to pound. "What are you saying, Victor?" He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the swirling snow. "I am saying that I have grown accustomed to your presence, that this cabin feels more like a home now than it has in 10 years. That I look forward to the evenings when we sit together, and I dread the thought of you leaving when spring comes." "I do not want to leave," Josephine said quietly. He turned to face her, and the expression on his face made her stand up, her mending falling forgotten to the floor. "You should not say things like that unless you mean them." "I mean them." She took a step toward him. "I mean them with everything in me. Josephine." Her name was a rough plea. "You do not understand what you are offering. Then explain it to me." He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, and suddenly his hands were on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "I am not a gentle man. I have lived rough and hard, and I do not know how to be anything other than what I am. I have nothing to offer you except this cabin and this life, which is isolated and difficult and lonely." "It is not lonely with you," she whispered. "And I do not need gentle. I need honest. I need real. I need someone who sees me as more than a burden or a problem to be solved." "I see you as everything," he said, and then he was kissing her, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that stole her breath. His arms went around her, pulling her against his chest, and she felt the solid strength of him, the heat of his body through their clothes. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks, her hands fisting in his shirt, trying to pull him even closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks." "I have wanted you to do that for weeks," she admitted. He laughed, a rough sound of surprise and pleasure. "Why did you not say anything? Why did you not?" "Because you deserved better than a mountain man with no prospects and a past he cannot discuss." "You are exactly what I need," Josephine said firmly. "And if you think I care about prospects or past mistakes, then you do not know me at all." He kissed her again, slower this time, thorough and deep, and she felt herself melting against him. His hands moved to her waist, then her back, holding her carefully as though she were something precious and fragile. "Stay with me," he murmured against her lips. "Not as an employee. Stay with me as my wife if you will have me." She pulled back to look at him, searching his face to see if he was serious. "You want to marry me?" "I want to marry you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you here in these mountains. I want to give you that home you have always wanted." His hands tightened on her waist. "But only if that is what you want too. I will not trap you here if you have dreams of something else." "You are my dream," Josephine said, and watched his face transform with joy. They were married 2 weeks later in Lewiston, in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through town. Josephine wore her blue coat over her best dress, and Victor wore clean buckskins and a shirt she had mended until it looked almost new. They spoke their vows in the judge's office with two strangers as witnesses, and when Victor slipped a plain gold ring onto her finger, Josephine started crying again. "Did you make this?" she asked, staring at the ring through her tears. "Yes, I forged it myself." He held up his own hand, showing her a matching band. "I made two. I wanted us to match." She threw her arms around his neck, not caring that they were in a public office, not caring about anything except the overwhelming love she felt for this man, who had given her everything she had never known she needed. The ride back to the cabin took most of the day, and by the time they arrived, Josephine was exhausted but happier than she had ever been in her life. Victor carried her across the threshold, a tradition he said he had heard about but never expected to observe, and set her down gently in the center of the cabin. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a revelation of skin and sensation that left Josephine gasping with wonder. Victor was patient and careful, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt like she had found the home she had been searching for her entire life. Winter closed in around them, deep and harsh, but inside the cabin they were warm and content. Josephine learned the rhythms of being a wife, the small intimacies of sharing space and life with another person. She learned that Victor snored lightly when he slept on his back, that he liked his coffee black and strong, that he had a habit of talking to himself when he was working through a problem. She learned, too, the pleasure of being touched with love rather than just necessity. Victor's hands on her body were reverent and skilled, drawing responses from her she had not known she was capable of giving. He seemed endlessly fascinated by her, learning what made her sigh with pleasure, what made her gasp and arch against him. "I never imagined this," she told him one night as they lay tangled together in bed, the firelight casting shadows across the walls. "I never imagined I could feel like this." "Like what?" He traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, complete. "Like all the broken pieces of me have finally been put back together." She turned to look at him. "You have given me so much, Victor, more than I can ever repay. You have given me just as much." He kissed her forehead. "You have given me a reason to come home. A reason to build something beyond just survival. You have given me hope for the future." They talked about that future often during those long winter nights. They wanted children eventually, when they felt ready for that responsibility. They wanted to expand the cabin, add another room for the family they hoped to create. Victor wanted to teach Josephine more about blacksmithing, and she wanted to teach him to read better, a skill he had only partially mastered. But mostly they just wanted to be together, to build a life based on love and respect, and the hard work they were both so accustomed to doing. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing the muddy earth beneath. Victor spent long days checking his trap lines and preparing the garden for planting. Josephine worked alongside him, her hands growing strong and capable from the constant labor. One afternoon in late April, as they were repairing the fence around the garden to keep out deer, Josephine felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She sat down hard on the ground, and Victor was beside her instantly, his hands on her face, his eyes worried. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "I do not know. I have been feeling strange for a few days now." She pressed a hand to her stomach. "My stomach has been unsettled in the mornings." Victor went very still. "Josephine, could you be pregnant?" She stared at him as the pieces fell into place. The queasiness, the fatigue, the way her body had felt different lately. "I think I might be." The joy that spread across his face was so pure and intense that it brought tears to her eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "A baby." We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? She asked, even though she could see that he was. Happy does not begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her. But are you happy? Are you ready for this? Yes, she said with absolute certainty. Yes, I am ready. They made the trip down to Lewiston a week later, so the doctor could confirm what they already knew. Josephine was indeed pregnant, about 2 months along, and the baby would likely arrive in late November or early December. The doctor gave them advice about her health and nutrition, warnings about the risks of childbirth in such an isolated location. But Josephine barely heard him. She was too focused on the wonder of it, the miracle growing inside her. The pregnancy was not easy. She was sick frequently in the early months, barely able to keep food down, and Victor hovered over her with an anxiety that would have been comical if it had not been so sweet. He brought her mint tea to settle her stomach, cool cloths when she was feverish, and endless patience when she was irritable and uncomfortable. As the months passed, and her belly grew round, Victor became even more protective. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too long in the garden. He did most of the household chores himself, despite her protests that she was pregnant, not dying. "You are carrying our child," he said firmly. "You need to rest and stay healthy. Let me take care of you." It was hard for Josephine to accept being cared for after a lifetime of caring for others, but she gradually learned to let him help her, to lean on his strength when her own was depleted. Summer passed in a blur of preparation. They expanded the cabin, adding a small room that would serve as a nursery. Victor built a cradle from smooth pine, spending hours sanding it until there was not a single rough edge that might harm delicate baby skin. Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small the garments were, how impossible it seemed that a human being could be so tiny. In late August, as Josephine sat in the shade shelling peas, she felt the baby move for the first time. The sensation was strange and fluttering, like a bird trapped beneath her ribs, and she called out for Victor with such urgency that he came running from the forge, hammer still in hand, convinced something was wrong. "The baby moved," she said, pressing both hands to her belly. "I felt it move." Victor dropped to his knees beside her chair, placing his large hand carefully on her swollen stomach. They waited breathlessly, and then it happened again, a small but distinct push against his palm. The expression on Victor's face was one of pure wonder, and Josephine felt her heart expand with love for this man who had become her entire world. The first snow came early that year, in mid-October, and Victor began to worry about the birth. Lewiston was a difficult journey in winter, and getting a doctor up to the cabin would be nearly impossible if complications arose. But there was a Nez Perce woman named Blue Sky who lived a few miles away, a skilled midwife who Victor trusted completely. He made arrangements with her to be available when the time came, paying her in advance with furs and metalwork. Josephine went into labor on the 1st of December, 3 weeks earlier than expected. The contractions started just after dawn, and by midday they were strong enough that Victor rode out to fetch Blue Sky, leaving Josephine alone for a terrifying hour before they returned. Blue Sky was a woman of indeterminate age, with strong hands and kind eyes, and she took over the cabin with quiet authority. She sent Victor outside, ignoring his protests, and focused all her attention on Josephine. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the afternoon and into the night. Josephine had never known pain like this, wave after wave of agony that left her gasping and weeping. Blue Sky stayed beside her, offering encouragement and support, but there were moments when Josephine was certain she would die, that this baby would be the death of her. But finally, As the clock ticked past midnight and into the 2nd of December, the baby came, sliding into blue skies, waiting hands with a wail that filled the cabin. "A son," Blue Sky announced, placing the squalling infant on Josephine's chest. "A strong, healthy son." Josephine stared down at the tiny face, the eyes squeezed shut, the mouth open in outrage at being forced into the cold world, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. This was her son. Hers and Victor's. This perfect, beautiful creature they had made together. Blue Sky cleaned them both up and then, finally, allowed Victor back inside. He came through the door looking haggard and terrified, and his eyes went immediately to Josephine and the bundle in her arms. "You have a son," she said softly. "Come meet your son." Victor approached slowly, as though afraid to startle them, and when Josephine placed the baby in his arms, she watched this strong, capable man begin to cry. He held the infant with infinite care, staring down at the small face with an expression of absolute devotion. "He is perfect," Victor whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for giving me everything." They named him Thomas after Victor's father, a man Victor had not spoken of before but who he said had been kind despite his own difficult circumstances. Little Thomas was a demanding baby, crying often and sleeping rarely, but neither of them minded. They took turns walking the floor with him in the middle of the night, both of them exhausted but happier than they had ever been. Winter that year was particularly harsh, with storms that lasted for days and snow that piled higher than the windows. But inside the cabin, they created their own world, warm and safe and full of love. Josephine learned to nurse Thomas while doing other tasks, becoming adept at working one-handed while a baby suckled at her breast. Victor learned to change diapers and soothe colicky crying, skills he had never imagined he would need, but which he approached with the same determined focus he brought to everything else. As Thomas grew from a helpless newborn into a baby who could smile and coo and grab at things, Josephine found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. A little over a year ago, she had been alone and desperate, standing beside a broken wagon with no hope and no future. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son who depended on her, and a home that was truly hers. The ring Victor had forged for her still gleamed on her finger, a constant reminder that she was valued, that she was loved, that she finally belonged somewhere. She had spent her entire life owning nothing new, making do with cast-offs and hand-me-downs, and now she had something so precious and new that it took her breath away every time she thought about it. She had a family. She had a home. She had a future. Spring returned to the mountains in a rush of snowmelt and birdsong. Thomas was 5 months old now, a chubby, happy baby who loved to watch his father work at the forge and who laughed whenever his mother sang to him. They took him outside for the first time in months, and he stared at the world with wide, wondering eyes, reaching for everything he saw. Victor had become impossibly dear to Josephine over the long winter. She loved the way he was with Thomas, so gentle and patient with their son despite his massive size and rough appearance. She loved the way he still looked at her with desire even though her body had changed, grown softer and rounder with pregnancy and birth. She loved the life they had built together, the small routines and rituals that made them a family. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Thomas asleep between them in his cradle, Victor took Josephine's hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future." "Oh," she laced her fingers through his. "I want to make this place bigger, better. I want to build you a proper house with real windows and a second floor. I want to build a bigger forge so I can take on more work. I want to create something that Thomas can inherit someday, something solid and lasting." Victor, this cabin is already more than I ever dreamed of having. But you deserve more. You and Thomas both. You deserve everything I can possibly give you." He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Josephine. I loved you from the moment I saw you beside that broken wagon, looking so lost and brave. And I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel lost again." "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I can ever express. You saved me, Victor, in every way a person can be saved." He pulled her close, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They sat like that, as the sun sank below the horizon. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful out of loneliness and need. The years that followed were full and rich. They did build a bigger house, eventually, a solid 2-story structure with real glass windows and a proper forge building separate from the living space. Josephine started a small business selling baked goods and preserved foods to the mining camp in Lewiston, using the money to buy things they needed and saving the rest for Thomas's future. Thomas grew into a sturdy little boy with his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. He learned to walk in the meadow behind their house, chasing butterflies and picking wildflowers for his mother. He learned to talk early, chattering constantly about everything he saw and experienced. When Thomas was 3 years old, Josephine became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. And in March of 1880, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Josephine's mother. Margaret was a calm, serious baby who rarely cried, and who seemed to observe the world with thoughtful intelligence from the very beginning. Victor was just as devoted to his daughter as he was to his son, and watching this big, rough mountain man cradle his tiny daughter and sing to her in his rumbling voice made Josephine fall in love with him all over again. They were happy. Despite the hard work and isolation, despite the harsh winters and difficult circumstances, they were genuinely, deeply happy. They had built a life together based on respect and love, and the shared understanding of what it meant to struggle and survive. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Victor presented Josephine with a gift. It was a simple wooden box, beautifully made, with their initials carved into the lid. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a mountain. It was delicate and lovely, clearly made by Victor's own hands. "It is beautiful," Josephine breathed. "I wanted to give you something special, something that represents what we have built here together." He fastened the necklace around her throat. "You changed my life, Josephine. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a family, a purpose, a reason to build something lasting. I will never be able to thank you enough for that." "You gave me just as much," she replied. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You saw value in me when I could not see it in myself. You loved me when I did not know what love truly meant." She touched the pendant at her throat. "Everything I have, everything I am, I owe to you." "We owe each other," he corrected gently. "That is what marriage is, what family is. We lift each other up, we make each other stronger." That night, after the children were asleep, they made love with the practiced ease of long familiarity, but also with the passion that had never dimmed between them. Josephine marveled, as she often did, at how lucky she was to have found this man, to have been given this life. More years passed. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, learning blacksmithing and hunting and all the skills needed to survive in the mountains. Margaret grew into a clever, capable girl who loved to read and who showed a talent for drawing. They added 2 more children to their family, a son named William in 1883 and another daughter named Sarah in 1886. The house was always full of noise and activity, of children laughing and arguing and playing. Victor built additions to accommodate their growing family, and Josephine kept everyone fed and clothed through sheer determination and hard work. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were content. On a cool September evening in 1891, 15 years after that broken wagon wheel had changed both their lives forever, Josephine and Victor sat on their porch watching their children play in the meadow. Thomas was 19 now, a young man courting a girl from Lewiston. Margaret was 11, William 8, and Sarah 5. The sun was setting in brilliant shades of orange and gold, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked softly. "Marrying me, taking on such a large family." Victor looked at her in surprise. "Regret you?" "Never, not for a single moment. I just wonder sometimes if you miss the solitude you had before, the simplicity." He took her hand, the one that still wore the ring he had forged for her all those years ago. The gold was worn now, scratched and dented from years of hard use, but she had never taken it off, not once. "The solitude was just loneliness," he said. "I did not know that until you came along and showed me the difference. This life, with you and our children, this is everything I ever wanted but never knew to hope for." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her scarred knuckles. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Josephine Kaine, you and the family we have built together." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play as darkness slowly descended on the mountains. This life had not been easy. There had been winters when food was scarce, summers when drought threatened their garden, moments of fear and worry and heartache. But through it all they had had each other, and that had been enough. More than enough. The ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming softly, a reminder of the day a mountain man had given her something new, something made just for her with his own hands. That ring had been the beginning, the first gift in a life that had been full of gifts. A home, a family, love that had lasted and deepened over the years, security and belonging and purpose. She had never owned anything new in her life until Victor Kaine had forged her a ring and offered her his heart. Now she owned everything that truly mattered, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was the richest woman in the world. As the stars began to emerge overhead and their children's laughter echoed across the meadow, Josephine closed her eyes and breathed in the mountain air, grateful beyond measure for the broken wagon wheel that had led her here, to this place, to this man, to this beautiful life they had created together. They had found each other in desperation and built something lasting out of hope and hard work. They had taken nothing and made it into everything. And the love that had started that cold September night 15 years ago still burned bright, warming them both against whatever challenges the future might bring. This was home. This was family. This was love that would endure as long as the mountains themselves, steady and strong and forever true. And it had all started with a ring forged by a mountain man's hands. A simple band of gold that represented everything Josephine had never known she needed, and everything Victor had always wanted to give. They had saved each other in the end, two lost souls finding their way home through the wilderness, together.